Hello and welcome back to another video on this series where I'm going to be discussing simple yet powerful responses to the problem of evil. In this video, we're going to be discussing the second problem of evil of Dostoyevsky. It's the second Dostoyevskian theodicy, following from the Theodicy of Mystery that we discussed in the last video. So if you want to check that out, like the Theodicy of Mystery in more depth, make sure you go check that out in the card above. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you're going to enjoy that video as well. And without the way, let's get into this video on the Theodicy of Love. This is the second theodicy that Dostoyevsky raises. So in this video, I like to cover three things. First, why is it Dostoyevsky? What's the context of this theodicy and how it finds its roots in the works of Dostoyevsky? The second thing that I would like to discuss is, well, how is this theodicy really powerful and why I like it a lot? And finally, I would like to discuss its relationship in this massive group of theodicies that I have raised, because I think that each theodicy plays a different role and has a different approach to the problem of evil. So let us get started with the video. And let's discuss the first question that I want to talk about. Well, why is this theodicy Dostoyevskian? Of course, this theodicy can be found throughout the Bible as a very important response to the problem of evil, but the climax of the history of this theodicy, in my opinion, is found within the works of Dostoyevsky. Out of all writers of history, very few literature writers or philosophers could ever claim to have suffered as much as the character of Dostoyevsky in his life, from when he was almost executed by the government to his years spent in Siberia, and also when his son died and his epileptic fits throughout his life and how he felt the guilt for the death of his 3-year-old son Alyosha, who also died from epileptic fits. He blamed himself for that death. Throughout his entire life, he constantly struggled with suffering, and especially if you look at the Russian history of the time, Russia, though was a great country, also suffered from a lot of periods of difficulties. So with this context in mind, we see that Dostoyevsky is one of the most powerful figures or philosophers who has suffered or struggled with the problem of evil, because suffering just surrounded him throughout his entire life. And it's through this suffering that I think we can understand more about the problem of evil. So let's move on to the second question. We've seen a bit of his context, but what exactly is the Theodicy of Love, and how can we find it in the works of Dostoyevsky, and how does Dostoyevsky raise it? So the Theodicy of Love is essentially a theodicy which asks us to meditate on God's love and compare the greatness of God's love to the evil in this world. And at face value, it's not a response to the logical problem of evil. It doesn't say God exists, evil exists, and love solves this so-called or apparent logical contradiction. Instead, it is more focused towards the emotional or the evidential problem of evil, and tries to respond to the problem of evil by saying that God's love is significantly greater than the evil in this world, and hence we should focus on God's love. And when we do so, we realize that the problem of evil is a very insignificant problem. I'm not saying that there's very little evil in this world. Of course, there's a lot of evil in this world, but when compared to God's love, it is insignificant. So with this in mind, let's discuss how we find it in Dostoyevsky's work. And I think by reading Dostoyevsky and understanding the context of his work, we do have a great appreciation for the strength of this theodicy, which at face value does not seem to be the most powerful theodicy out there, but as time goes on, we soon realize that it is actually very powerful, especially when we take into account the works of Dostoyevsky. And the book that I would like to focus on the most is the brothers Karamazov, because it's in this book where he really focuses on the problem of evil. Although there's definitely traces of these problems in The Idiot, which could sometimes be seen as, well, the development or his first try at writing the brothers Karamazov. The Brothers is definitely the most powerful work discussing the problem of evil, and is in fact the book which poses the problem of evil the most powerful as well. And as I've said in my last video on the Theodicy of Mystery, Dostoyevsky never directly raises a response to the problem of evil. Throughout his books and throughout his works, he has a massive chunk of writing on the problem of evil raised in the Grand Inquisitor by Ivan, in the chapter before the Grand Inquisitor, also by Ivan, and also throughout the suffering that Dmitri and Fyodor and all the other characters endure. And it's through these different characters that we truly see that the strength of the problem of evil, or we see that the problem of evil is truly exemplified. we have a lot of issues of where the problem of evil and how strong it is, but when we compare it to the works or the responses to the problem of evil that Dostoyevsky raises, we see that it's actually very short. Rarely does he actually write against or explicitly write against the problem of evil, and if we had to compare the lines or the arguments in a syllogism form, you'll perhaps see a large chunk or a large syllogism for the problem of evil, whereas only maybe one or two lines as a response to the problem of evil. And you might think, well, that's very problematic. As a Christian philosopher and a writer, you'll think that his response to the problem of evil should be as powerful, if not stronger, than the problem that he's raising against the existence of God. And that is a very strong view and one of the main interpretations of Dostoevsky's work. And in fact, that was what I was thinking the entire time of reading the Brothers Karamazov, until I finished reading the problem or the book, when I thought, well, hold on a minute, why do I not feel shaken by the problem of evil? Because he's raised a massive argument for the problem of evil and very little arguments against. Is it because I'm being irrational, or is it because Dostoevsky has masterfully made a response to it, but in a subconscious response to it? And I think it's this latter option. It's the idea that Dostoyevsky did in fact raise a very powerful solution to the problem of evil, but he just did not do it in the way that we would expect. And the way he did do it was actually hide the problem of evil, or his response to the problem of evil, via the life of the characters. Just as he raised the problem of evil via the actions and the suffering of his characters, well, of course, the Grand Inquisitor was a story said or a philosophical poem written by Ivan. We can see that the characters embody the problem of evil, just as the characters embody the responses to the problem of evil. And I think the two characters which best respond or represent this response to the problem of evil is undeniably Alyosha and Father Zosima, with Dmitri being a secondary kind of response to the problem of evil. Essentially, what the role of Alyosha and Father Zosima does in the entire book is represent the love of God for humanity. And this is very clear when you realize that the son, Alyosha, actually has the same name as Dostoyevsky's deceased son, who was also called Alyosha. And you can see that there's a direct connection to this. And in a lot of ways, you can view the Brothers Karamazov as his thinking of how he wanted his son to grow up when he grew older. Because if we look at Dostoyevsky's notes, we do realize that he was actually planning to write a sequel to the Brothers Karamazov about Alyosha when he grew up, even older. So what we can see is that Alyosha is seen, like Mushkin, the Mushkin in The Idiot, is seen as kind of the more perfect or the ideal Christian, or the ideal person in Dostoyevsky's philosophy. And what we see throughout the entire story or the novel is that Alyosha always acts out of love, and love is one of the strongest attributes of Alyosha's life, and the same goes with Father Zosima, who is most commonly agreed to be a representation of Dostoyevsky's response and his life in regards to the monastery where he went after the death of his son to kind of capture or get his life back on track again. So from Zosima and Alyosha, we see a great emphasis on love, and despite the lack of perhaps direct philosophical arguments in response to Ivan, who is seen as the more philosophical one in the book, or the smartest one in the book, Alyosha's love in response to this provides a perfect balance to Ivan's hard, somewhat self-destructive philosophy, and we can see that the problem of evil is weakened significantly, and the climax of this weakening of the problem of evil is actually also the climax of the strength of this problem of evil, and that is raised in the chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, which I've raised before. And here Ivan provides powerful arguments against the goodness of God and really strengthens the problem of evil. And what we see here is that in response to this entire chapter, I wouldn't want to go into depth here because it's just a significant and fascinating chapter which I don't think this video could possibly glimpse a slight bit of it, but I would like to raise Alyosha's response to this problem of evil, which is very interesting. And in response to the Grand Inquisitor, all Alyosha does is kiss Ivan on the lips. And you might say, well, how is that supposed to be a response? And I think it's via this kiss to Ivan that Alyosha summarizes, or Dostoyevsky summarizes his entire response to evil that he experienced in his life. Fundamentally, I think, and the thing which goes in most novels or works of fiction, is that the characters in a book represent the psyche of the writer himself. As someone who likes writing fiction myself, and I'm currently working on a fiction novel, I definitely can say that the characters in my books represent the different psychological impacts or the psychological thoughts of myself, and that each characters embody a different part of my philosophy, and it's basically a constant struggle in the books represent a constant struggle in your life. And I think that is clear in Dostoyevsky's work, because you could see Mushkin, and a good example of this would be Mushkin's discussion on an executed man, or a man who's brought to execution. He really talks about and emphasizes the sadness and the brutality of the capital punishment. And that is undeniably a representation of Dostoyevsky's own experiences with the capital punishment. So with this in mind, we can expect to see Dostoyevsky's inner conflict represented by the characters. And a theme throughout the entire book about love is just, and especially the love of God, is he compares the love of God to the love that a father or a parent has for their children. And it's a very simple but very beautiful picture of love, because love is a very abstract concept which a lot of us do not have a full grasp of. And what I mean we don't have a full grasp of is not that we don't experience it, because definitely we do experience it, but that we don't really find a very logical response to what love actually is and how it actually comes to be. Because to those who have any experience whatsoever, you don't really have a perfect understanding or a grasp of love. You only really experience it. It's very hard to describe. And I think that is what Dostoevsky is trying to get here, is that the love of God is so immense and so overwhelming that even a small expression like a kiss could respond to all the evil in this world. And that is essentially what I think Dostoevsky is trying to do with the kiss that Alyosha gives to Ivan, and also his response to all the suffering he experienced in his life. He's saying, well, yes, the suffering I experienced is bad, but the love of God is so immense and so great that I rather follow God and follow that love instead of be overwhelmed by the suffering. And that is perfectly represented by, I think, what Alyosha also does is when he kisses the earth and says, I love the creation of God despite all this evil. And that, I think, is what Dostoevsky internally feels as his solution to all the suffering in his life. He's saying, yes, there is a lot of suffering in my life, but I dare say, and I do proclaim, that God's love is greater than all this suffering, and that it is a great response to the problem of evil from an emotional and evidential standpoint. And that, I think, leads us to the final discussion about how it plays, what role it plays in this entire group of theodicies. And I think that, unlike the other theodicies, which are responses to an atheist, the strength of this problem of evil or this theodicy is not that it perfectly responds to an atheist, because if someone raises the problem of evil and you say, well, God is love, or God is very loving, they might think you're insane. But of course, I mean, they might accept it, but most likely, and I've raised this before, they think, well, how can that possibly be? But I think the strength of this theodicy is that it appeals very strongly to those who have already experienced the love of God. And what I mean by that is that it is a very strong response or theodicy for us Christians struggling with the problem of evil. Because throughout my life, I've experienced a lot of suffering. And not myself, I haven't experienced a lot of suffering, but I've seen a lot of suffering in this world, and that's what I mean by experiencing suffering. I've gone to Africa twice. I've been to Mongolia. I've really interacted with people who have struggled with the suffering in their lives, and it's a very difficult and emotional issue here, because when I talk to these orphans, these people really sometimes have a really loss of hope or life, trust in the world around us. They look at the world and say that this world is really bad. And I'm currently in correspondence with someone in Africa and Uganda, to be specific. And basically what we do in our correspondence is that in every email he sends me, he always praises God and praises the love of God despite all the suffering that he goes through, especially during this time of COVID, where although his society and his situation was already quite poor, it became even worse with the arrival of COVID. So, I mean, what we see here is that despite all the suffering in his life, the love of God still shines stronger, and that despite all the suffering that he experiences, he can say from his internal conflict that the love of God is still greater, and that God's love does not get in the way of the evil. And that promise of love and that promise of eternity has in fact impacted my life, as well as a lot of Christians around us. While it's easy for us to say, well, God exists, well, how can he allow this evil in the world? We need to realize that God's love is so much greater than that evil, that if we focus on God's love and less on the evil in this world, we do start solving, or at least feeling more soothed about the problem of evil. And that is in fact what I'm going to wrap up on here, is that in my life, I've always tried to find a direct logical response to absolutely everything by reducing everything to direct logic and saying, well, this thing has to be logically defeated. But as time goes on, you soon realize that a lot of arguments against Christianity, like the problem of evil, has moved beyond the logical stage. We've already solved or provided a proper defense to the logical problem of evil in the free will defense, which shows that God and evil is logically compatible and that they're not mutually exclusive. So since we're living in a post logical problem of evil way, we have to solve the grander problem of evil, which is the emotional problem of evil. And this is where the Theodicy of Love comes in. Now, I would like to finally direct you to the Brothers Karamazov to read that if you want to learn more about the problem of evil. Of course, the Brothers Karamazov is like a 1,000 something page book and has a really deep discussion and struggle with the problem of evil throughout the entire thing. I've tried my best to express or describe the problem of evil, or at least the Theodicy of Love, to you, and how it's a powerful response. But if you want to know more about it, the best place to go is undeniably to read the works of Dostoyevsky. So, without further ado, I hope you have a great week. I hope that you stay safe. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button. Also, if you want to watch a discussion that I'm doing with Zach, who is the YouTuber of Adherent Apologetics, make sure you go check his channel out at tomorrow, 8 AM Hong Kong time, or Eastern time. What time is it for them? Is, I think, 7 PM Eastern time, where I'm going to be doing a debate review with him on his recent debate on the existence of God with a guy called Randolph. So if you want to check that out, make sure you check that out. The link is going to be in the description below for that debate, and also a link for his channel will be in the description below. Have a great week, stay safe, I hope to see you soon, and God bless. Thank you very much. Goodbye.